Hey, everybody out there on the internet. My name's Keith Tanner. I'm from Flyin Miata, and I'm going to talk about something that is not your usual Miata topic today. So, what you're going to see today is a peek into some of the stuff that I like to play with when I'm not doing Miata-based stuff or work-based stuff, or I'm just kind of dinking around. So I will get to that moment. Basically, I've built an analog race dash, is what I call it. But while we're waiting for the last couple of people to get into the room here and sit down at the back of the chairs in the back, you know those guys, I'm just going to remind you that we have a special T-shirt that's for sale right now. We do a T-shirt every month. We blatantly stole the idea from the guys at Blip Shift, who do great stuff. I'm wearing a Blip Shift shirt right now. But we have a very cool one that takes off on the Motorsports is Dangerous placards that you might see in the UK up on every fence and everything like that. It says Motorsports is fun. It's a big sort of warning thing on the back. That's for sale until Tuesday. And then we will close down the order books. We'll print them up. We'll ship them out to you. And they're basically $20 shipped inside the US. So great, kind of a fun shirt, suitable for motorsports activities of all styles and limited edition. So if you're watching this in the future on YouTube, I apologize. That sale is now closed. If you're watching it live on Facebook Live, well then you're lucky. So enough of that. Now I think we've let people get in here. I'm going to talk about my analog race dash. And what that means is we've all seen race dashes. They're just basically blank screens, usually with a bunch of stuff displayed on a screen. Sometimes there'll be a row of LEDs along the top, a couple of things like that. And I sort of got sidetracked and ended up building one that looked like a standard dashboard, gauge panel. So I'll start off with, what do you think, Travis? Should I start off with a quick sweep of the needles to get people's attention, or should I go through the whole story here? Through this entire thing, this is going to be a little different than our usual Miata-based tech talks. There's a lot of other technologies got pulled into this, a lot of cool toys. So please ask questions. That always helps. If there's something you don't understand, or something you want to know, if there's something that you know that I don't, which is very likely, then feel free to throw something in there. The conversation is what makes this much more interesting than just me standing up here yammering away for half an hour or whatever. Yeah, you know what? I'm going to talk about the idea, where this came from first. I'll show you the cool needle stuff in a moment. Basically, this car here, it's an NA Miata with some slight modifications. One of those modifications includes a non-standard transmission that can't support the mechanical speedometer that you get in an NA. The standard NA speedometer is literally, it's old school, as a cable comes in the back of this thing, it spins stuff around and it makes a needle move. There's even little springs in there. And the problem is that without the cable, it doesn't work. There are ways to make them work. One of them is what we often call a Gerbil Box, which is literally a box with a motor in it that runs a little short piece of cable. It brings in the digital signal from the transmission and spins it around. It's very analog, but the problem is it's got a little bit of a lag to it. The cables can be short-lived, and it's just kind of a kludge, you know? I could have also, and this was my plan, installed an NB cluster, because the NB does use an electronically driven speedometer. And weirdly, Mazda made these an almost but not quite perfect fit. These two holes are swapped, basically. So one's a locating pin and one's a screw. Why? I don't know why. And I would have had to do some wiring, obviously. There's some different wiring involved there. And I kind of got distracted when talking about controlling tachometers and emulating a chronometric tachometer, which is an old 1930s style tach that was more like clockwork than we were used to seeing, with very characteristic movement capabilities. And I got started talking about controlling stepper motors, and one thing led to another, and I found myself building electrically driven gauges or computer-controlled gauges for the Miata. Is this any questions yet, Travis? Everyone's just going, oh my God, what the hell? I apologize for the language if that offended you, but if it did, I have bad news for you in the future. So I will give the demo now. Here's what I have come up with, and I've thrown a few extra things in here. Let me turn this on here, Travis, make sure it works. There we go, it's booting up. I can't actually see what it's doing right now, but there you go. One problem I do have is the needles are currently slipping on the ends of the motors right now. So the needles are losing their zeros. Fun fact, well, I'll get to that in a moment. But there's a little LED over here you guys can see, and that is a fun thing I built into it. That is a real-time friction circle indicator. The idea, I can get this in front so you can see them. Can you see them both there, Travis? Mm-hmm. So the idea there, if you're familiar with the concept of the friction circle, which is that you only have a certain amount of traction available, and if you're using some of that traction for cornering, you can't use it for braking at the same time. You have to balance off the two of them. You've only got so much of each available, and if you plot it out, it's basically a circle. So this is showing me what direction I'm moving in. Of course, the car's facing the wrong way right now, which is why it's left and right. And if I'm braking, I'm accelerating, and the color is indicating how hard I'm doing that. So if I'm coming in, I can't see the light. If I'm braking and cornering at the same time, the color and intensity of that light tells me how close I am to the edge of the friction circle. Now, I mean, obviously, in the car, this would be strapped down with the car itself. I just found it easier to move around the Hot Wheels, the Miata Dynamic Simulator, than it was to do anything else. So that was kind of a fun thing I built into this. So whee! And at the same time, what happens if you run out of oil pressure, for example? It has freak-out modes for other things. There we go, no oil pressure. Okay, we have oil pressure, we're good again. So that's basically what I ended up with. And let me just shut that down. This came out of basically two things. One, I learned how to control the needles. And two, I learned how to control the LEDs that are behind those gauge faces. And then I had to build custom gauge faces. It's kind of fun. So I'm going to walk through the process of what's going on here, what's talking to what. Should we fire it up to you, Travis? People want to see it live?
Oh, I'm sure.
I think they will.
Xander says this is probably pretty sure all his fault.
Xander Molesky definitely is, at the very least, a solid enabler, if not completely at fault for this. So this is hooked into the car right now. It's hooked in through the CAN signal, and I'll get to that in a moment. But this will follow, and you'll see what I did with the tachometer. I apologize, the needle has slipped. It's 1,000 RPM off, but we can't run this for very long because Travis and I will die from asphyxiation, but it will be enough to see what's going on. Can you still breathe, Travis? Okay, good. Yeah, if Travis falls down, you'll know what happens because we smoked him out here. Did we leave it? Yeah, it left itself a little bit ugly. There we go. So as you might have seen in that, I decided at the same time, I'm a big fan of LED tachometers, the little strip style ones that you see in Formula One. I run them in this car. I've run them for years. I've run them in my other cars. I like them. I very much like them as a way to see what's going on with the tachometer, with the engine speed. And so I built one in behind the needle. And that was kind of fun to play with. It's also got a peak indicator that's got a 500 millisecond, half second lag time, hang time. So it shows you where you've been. So, if you're shifting, you can see what your shift points were. Goofy stuff. It's mostly along the lines of, I have these capabilities, what can I do? So I'll explain what it's all built out of here. So the base of it is a Raspberry Pi, which is the bottom level in this little sandwich of circuit boards here. A Raspberry Pi is a small Linux computer, basically. Little bit embedded computer. It's a surprisingly smart little thing for its size. I'll show you. They get as small as what they call a Zero. That's a Pi Zero. That thing's got wireless on it. It's got, I forget how much memory this one has. You can hook in all sorts of things. It'll run cameras. It'll do all sorts of things. But basically, it's a little tiny Linux computer. I've even set up the entire Flyin Miata website on one of these things just for fun. But they're quite powerful. You can also use an Arduino, which is a slightly older microcontroller that is a little more specialized in a lot of ways. It's less of a sort of general computing thing that this is. The reason I like to use Pis is because I'm more familiar with them. I live in the Unix world day in, day out. So this is a familiar platform for me. But it's a great little platform. There's lots of open source support for it, lots of community support, and that's what's on the bottom. It's basically a little computer. On top of that is a special can. They're called hats. I think because they wear them as hats. I'd like to think that's the reason. This is a CAN translation, and that is actually taking the signal from the car. So I'll get into what the whole CAN thing is in a moment. And then this one on top is designed to run stepper motors. It's designed to run the motors that are in this thing. So this is what the gauges are running in the background. This is a stepper motor, which is basically, this is actually off a Silverado. I think. GM uses these things by the billions probably. And it's a very precise little motor. If you see 3D printers, plotters, all sorts of things, you see these stepper motors used everywhere, and they're very precise because you can tell it to move one step at a time, or even little bits of a step, so you can get very, very high precision. This has 600 steps over 315 degrees of range, so it's quite precise, and you can control it. Just tell it to move up, move down, and that's what I'm doing with the thing. And so this is what allows it's basically the interface that allows the Pi to talk to this little guy. I'm not following my train of thought very closely here, but there you go. I could also try to control the standard Miata gauges, which are what's called an air core gauge, which is it's a simpler thing. You just put a couple of different voltages on here. I may still do that because it may give me faster response. It will certainly allow me to use a Miata needle, because I discovered over the course of this that the pin on the tachometer is smaller than the pin on the speedometer. And the pin on my stepper gauges is right in between. And that means I cannot put the needle from a tachometer on here because it's too tight. If I put the needle from a speedometer on here, it's a little bit too loose, and that's when I get the slipping going on that I got going on here. You learn things about these cars. I never knew that, but there you go. All these years of swapping gauges around, I never knew that you could do that. Anyhow, someday I may change it out to use a different kind of gauge, but I started off learning how to use stepper motors. I figured I would learn how to use stepper motors. So the CAN aspect of this thing, I needed some way to get information into the dashboard. And this car, having the LS engine, the V8 engine, it runs a GM computer, and that means that the GM computer is always sending out information on its CAN network. And I have spent quite a bit of time inside the GM and Mazda CAN networks as part of our NDV8 program. So I'm comfortable in there and familiar in there, and all the information I need is in that data stream. So what this little middle hat allows me to do, it's called a PiCan, of all things, PiCan 3, is it allows me to take the signals, listen in on the signals being broadcast around the car, and pull out the ones I need. I can pull out the ones for engine speed, I can pull out the ones for coolant temperature, I can pull out ones for is the check engine light on. There's all sorts of stuff in there, but those are some of the ones I'm using. You may have noticed when this thing fired up, was the blue line on there, Travis? I think it was.
I think so.
It's got a variable red line on it, like, say, an old BMW M3 or M5, probably some of the newer ones as well. But basically, the blue lines that were up here was an indication of where the red line should be, given that the car is cold, and as it warms up, it will get shorter and shorter and shorter until it goes away. It's kind of a fun thing I could throw in there. So this just gives me a way to interface with the car easily. If you were trying to make this talk to a normal Miata, so especially an NA, you wouldn't be able to do that, but you would be able to count ignition pulses and do all the things that the normal gauge cluster does. Do we have any questions going on?
Lots of compliments. I haven't seen any questions yet.
Got about 3 people who are watching this who understand what's going on. Everyone else is going, make the lights flash again. Which, honestly, if I was trying to learn all this fast, I would be the exact same. So that's what this little guy does. And I'll get into how I built the gauges as well, because the gauges themselves, I'm really happy with how they look. Part of the goal of this, I don't know how it became the goal, was to make it look like a more or less stock cluster. I didn't want it to look like someone had just taken a screen and jammed it in there and made it work. The idea with this is to make it look as if it belongs here, that Mazda put it there in the first place. And some of the key to that was this special material. It's an acrylic. This is my test ring, as you can see, that looks like matte black until you put a light behind it. And then it shines through. So it's perfect for putting LEDs behind, because they disappear completely, especially when it's dark inside. But you can light them up through there. I'm going to turn this on for a second. Let's see. There you go. The reason it does that, for a stepper motor, it doesn't know where it is. It only knows where it's going. It sort of navigates by dead reckoning. So you got to start by saying, okay, here's all the way to one side, here's all the way to the other, and now I know where 0 is. So let's see, let's set it to 3,000 RPM. I mean, it's probably not 3,000 RPM. Yeah, see, the LEDs see it. There's that variable red line. I haven't got it set up for the full 7,000 RPM. This is very much a work in progress right now. But yeah, you can see the LEDs coming through that background, which is very cool. Actually, let me just turn that off. Set it back down to 0. And yes, this thing has Wi-Fi, so I can this. Turn everything off. Where is it? There it is. We shut off?
Yep.
Okay. Let's see if I remember all the incantations for doing this. Oh. I'm not going to bother doing this. Trying to run this thing off the command line. I am literally, this is old school, like green text on a black background, because it's just kind of fun. You can do graphical interfaces for Pis, but you know, what's the point? So I'll go back to how I built the gauges themselves. So the first thing was to come up, make sure I could work the LEDs through this. And this stuff is available from, I think I got it from Tap Plastics or ePlastics Online or someplace like this, but it's basically this LED transparent. And then I had to design an actual gauge face. And so there you go. Now we have the first Miata, maybe not the first, with wooden gauge faces. There we go. There's my speedometer. And those were cut on a laser cutter. I have a 40-watt laser cutter here down in the shop. It's a lot of fun to play with. And this is just made out of like just cheap hardboard. So that's the gauge look like. The problem is that the factory gauges, the gauge faces, are attached to the actual gauge itself. The gauge face is just a thin little sheet. And this is the structural part. I needed to hang my stepper motor off the back, so it needed to be structural, which meant I had to actually attach it to the cluster. And so that was just a matter of, I put some little nylon nuts and bolts on here, some little standoffs. And this thing is my template. So I could drill the holes in the right place. It's got a middle piece that's the perfect diameter there to go in there. And this line gives me a vertical so I can square it up, so I make sure the tack is square. And then I have my 3 mounting points I can drill. Biggest problem was not drilling all the way through and putting a little white dot on here, which, as you can see, I did. This is obviously a practice one. It was cracked before. Any questions, Travis? No questions. I'm obviously baffling everybody, whether they're just looking at the pretty lights or I'm not making any sense at all. All are possible. So once I had the design worked out in this hardboard, I then cut it out of plastic, and this is something I learned from Xander, is the plastic has a mask on it. When you cut it, that's actually part of what you need to cut it. And if you engrave that off, it works as a mask. You just hit it with some spray paint, and you can put lettering on. So that's what I've done here. This thing was masked. I ran it through the laser, engraved off the 100 and the 2 little lines, sprayed it down with high-end Rust-Oleum, and peel the mask off. The hardest part is waiting long enough for the paint to dry, because you want to do it right away, but you have to wait for it to dry, or you end up with fingerprints everywhere. So that's how the gauge faces were made. I'm really, really happy with how they turned out, because they look pretty much normal. They do have a downside in that you can't really backlight them. I mean, you can, but it just kind of get this weird sickly glow. It's not attractive. So I'm hoping the LEDs in the background will help light this up at night. Chances are it will not be all that functional light at night, and we'll just have to rely on the LEDs behind the tachometer. But I am looking at edge lighting this thing a little bit, doing something like that. I don't know. I'm still making this up. I do have some plans for future. Let me check my notes here. You guys are really getting Keith just rambling on here. I do have plans to take full advantage of what's back here, because I've got a full set of tools. I can control those LEDs. There's 60 LEDs in each of the rings behind the gauges. I have full control over each one about how bright they are, what color they are. And so I can do a bunch of different things with them. You've seen what I'm doing with the, I'll turn that back on again because it's fun.
Run your test pattern?
Yeah, let's run the test pattern, yeah. So the LED flash at the beginning there is completely just, the function is actually called show off. It's just there to show it off. And yeah, there's my cool little dynamic emulation device showing off the friction circle indicator. I'll put a switch on so I can turn that on and off. So that uses the full circle. There we go. Stay still. That uses the full circle. The tachometer only uses this much of it, and so I've got a few LEDs. I've got 15 LEDs or so, or 10. I've got a 45 degrees worth of LEDs down in the corner here I can use, and I'll use those for things like a high beam indicator or a check engine light indicator. As you have seen, I do hijack the speedometer ring for a low oil pressure indicator. I'm also going to do a similar one for high water temperature. I'll have it fade in blue probably as the water temp gets higher and higher, or green or orange, or I don't know. I don't want it. I want it to be distinct from oil. I've got a bunch of different things I can do with that, and I'm still coming up with ideas as to how I can use this. So if anybody has any ideas, definitely let me know. I could have an over rev indicator with everything going into freak out mode. I've got all the different colors I can use. This has got a 3-axis accelerometer in it, so we could have when you're jumping, when you land really hard, you could have the whole thing flash bright red or something. I don't know. Dukes of Hazzard mode. It's part of the fun now. The first part of this was building the tools. The next part is figuring out how to use them. I am going to put dimming into it as well. You probably can't see on the camera, but that double flash at the beginning is like a dim flash and a bright flash. The cameras have a little trouble with the LEDs, so you can't really see it, but that's basically showing, okay, when the headlights are on, it'll be the dim level. When the headlights are turned off and it's daytime, you get the bright level. So that's part of the intention. And also because this is a smart little computer with a surprising amount of memory and stuff like this, I could do things like have it log an entire drive. And then because it's got Wi-Fi, when I pull into my garage, it logs onto my network. It automatically downloads all of my logs onto a server. So I can sit there and replay my drive if I wanted to. I could also use it as a streaming service, a streaming music source if I wanted to, because, this is obviously all about the audio. We've talked about the audio in this car in the past. I could also hook a camera on it, so it's basically got a rolling dash cam. If there's a problem, it can check out what's going on, or track cam or whatever. Travis, do we have a question?
Question and a comment. First question, will the lights on the RPM act as a shift light?
So the question is, will the lights on the RPM act as a shift light? And I guess the question is, what does that mean? Do you want it to flash at you when it's time to shift, or do you want that indication all the way through as you're going? Here, I have a demo script here. This will probably... as I mentioned before, and those who have joined us, the needles are slipping on the gauges, which is why this is not zero. I apologize for that. But here's a quick demo of the tach of what it looks like. It's got zeroing. So pretend that the needle is lining up with with that little peak indicator. And this shows some of the different colors I can do, some of the different intensities. So I could have one side flash red when it's time to shift. Personally, I like having it. As you may have noticed when that was running, I don't know if I made it go high enough. It starts off green, then it goes yellow, then it goes red for the last little bit. And I like having that as an indication of, okay, I'm getting close to my shift point, as opposed to, oh my God, you got to shift now when the light goes off. So I don't get that quick sort of jerk reaction. So yes, it certainly could be a shift light. I prefer this sequential shift light, shall we say, but that's a personal preference. You could certainly program it to do that. It would be cake to do that. What was the second question? Comment?
Not really a question. Xander says he'd love to see it edge lit, and don't use the master brightness from the LEDs. The PWMs are at an annoyingly low rate. Scale your colors. And somebody else suggested flashing them when it's time to shift.
Now, those who are watching this, I apologize if you can't hear Travis. He's reading out some of the comments. Xander's giving me a suggestion on the intensity. It works better if you control the RGB value instead of the overall intensity brightness level. I've already figured that one out from experimentation. I'm just leaving that alone, and everything's being done with basically turning the colors up and down. Can you have the whole thing flash when it's time to shift? You certainly can. Part of the fun of this is now that I've built this tool, being able to change it, have it do something else is quite easy. I've got access to everything that the car's ECU knows about the car running. So I can take any of that information and throw it into what this is showing off. So it's engine coolant temperature. I have my oil pressure. I've got an oil pressure trigger in there already. I have, what else could we put in there, Travis? I don't think there's an accelerometer built into the stock ECU, but I have an accelerometer here. I've got it turned off right now. I'm going to run it through the demo again just because it's fun to see stuff moving around. I don't know if I went high enough to show off my red line. Yeah, you can't see it change color. I didn't go high enough. Whoops. It is set up above a certain engine RPM to show a different color. So it does, I forget where the breakpoints are. I think it's 5,000 or something like that. It starts showing yellow, and then it shows red for the red line. So it does give you an indication you're getting close to red line. But yeah, part of the fun of this is figuring out what to use it for. And that's what I'd love to hear ideas, because This is basically a race dash. Right now, it's just basically some gauges with a little bit of extra flair. You know, it's got follows the tachometer around, but it's got the capability to override to show things like that. Let's turn the friction circle indicator back on again. People just like seeing this move around. I like seeing it move around. So there's the friction circle indicator that I've built. This is this is something that, you know, the stock gauges can't do, but they could. What else can I do with all of these LEDs with this toys behind here? The edge lighting, I was thinking about that one in the shower this morning. Most of this design work is done in the shower, but the edge lighting is something I'm thinking about. It would be possible to take this, and as long as you don't want some of the really crazy features, you could probably build it into a standard gauge cluster. You could stash a pie. There's lots of room with these new gauges in here. I mean, I took out some monsters like this, and where's my speedometer? There's my speedometer. I took out this monster, and I'm replacing them with this. So I have loads of room behind me, or behind the dashboard. So I could stick a little pie in there, and I could probably run most of what I'm doing off the information that's going into a stock cluster. So you could actually make this as a full standalone. The one thing you would need on NA, you would need to add an electronic speedo signal, but that's easy. You take the NB one, it literally plugs right in the transmission, run 2 wires, done. So this does have some potential as a commercial product. I don't really think I want to go there. Brandon's been asking me how we can make this saleable. I think the problem is most people would want to customize it as much as possible, which would make it very difficult. You know, I want it just like that, but I want the needles to go the other way, which, by the way, is super easy to do. I could have reverse rotation needles. And I want the red line to be 8,000 RPM, and I want my name on the gauge faces. And what I will likely do is when I'm done with this, I'll publish the code, so anybody, and the parts list, so you can build your own. And I may, you know, the hard part will be the gauges, trying to figure out how to get the gauges to people. And I think there might be some ways to do that, but I will make the code so you can, available so you can do this at home. The biggest problem for trying to make this work in a Miata is this CAN interpreter I've got here, because the Miata doesn't, especially the NA and the NB, don't have this CAN data in their systems. They don't broadcast this stuff. So that's me taking advantage of the fact that this is really a Corvette wearing a fancy hat. But there are ways you can simply, you know, count the pulses. We could certainly make it work with a stock ignition signal, and that will probably happen eventually. At some point, I'll have one of these in one of my other Miatas just because it's fun. Any more questions over there, Travis?
I don't think so.
I have baffled people by going on and on about strange and odd things. What's that?
Or I just missed one.
Or Travis just missed one. Yeah, if there's a lot of comments, it can be a little difficult for Travis to see them all going by. So if you did ask a question and we didn't cover it, please throw it in there again. If you're on YouTube, obviously, and sometime in the future, we'll answer them in the comments. One other thing I could do, and I thought about doing, is I have room for more LEDs back there. I could put another ring in there, another 2 rings. I think I can go about 3 deep. You've got this little screen. It's easier to see here. Little screen on the factory dash that could be, you could put a little LCD screen behind there and do something interesting with it. Tire pressure sensor, yeah, tire temperature. You could put infrared sensors. You can get FLIR sensors for the Pi, and I could put 4 of them on there, so you could show your tire temperatures in each corner, or you could build it into one of these. And there's all sorts of interesting, cool stuff you could do. But the goal for me is to try to still make it look like a factory Miata gauge cluster. It's a lot of fun to play with. This pile of wires, this mayhem that's going on over here, this is very much the prototype version. This is just, it's easy to quickly move connections around, to add stuff in, to change stuff up. This looked different yesterday. It'll look different tomorrow. But when I'm done, I'm going to build a little case for this thing, and we'll clean up all the wiring and make it more of a plug-in. Travis, do we have a question?
Could this be easily adaptable to the NC and ND?
Would it be easily adaptable to the NC and the ND? Well, the ND already has CAN-driven gauges. So, I mean, maybe? Possibly. I have not looked into that. I don't have an NC to play with. I don't have an ND to play with a stock motor. Personally, this is what I have in my own garage. So when I'm done work and I feel like doing something interesting, instead of sitting on the couch and watching reruns, I come down here and I play with this. So I play with the cars that I own. I don't see why you couldn't do a lot of this. I don't know how easily you'd be able to integrate them into stock clusters. I know with the ND, we're already driving the tachometer, driving the speedometer of those things. On our V8 cars, we're already driving them through CAN. We're overriding some of that stuff. So you certainly could get in there. Adding the LEDs behind the gauge faces, I'd have to look at how they're constructed. But I don't see any reason why not. You couldn't. You should be able to do this with most cars, even if they're just running. Even my old MG over there, I could probably still put most. Well, my old MG is also a GM. It's running V8 with a CAN on it, but we'll ignore that part. Even if it was still an MG with an anemic little 1.8. Fun fact: if you put a supercharger on that 1.8, Moss Motor sells one, it'll have the same horsepower as that stock 1.6 Miata parked beside it. So that's why I took the engine out of that car. But in theory, I could do the same sort of thing with just the analog signals that come out of that car. It still has ignition pulses, so you just count the ignition pulses as your engine speed. You'd have to come up with some sort of wheel speed sensor. That one's easy. I get take it off the transmission. But on a stock MG, you could put a sensor on a drive shaft, a Hall effect sensor on a magnet on the drive shaft. A bunch of things you could do. So you could adapt this to just about any car if you feel like putting the time in. I've been working on this since December. There's a lot of hours in this. You would not want to pay for the development time as much as it is. But it's how you learn things. I mean, this is not a project I went into knowing how to build. This was a project I went into saying, okay, I've played with pies. I know a little bit of a CAN. How do I run a stepper motor? Well, I'll learn how to run a stepper motor. How do I run the LEDs in this thing? Well, I had to run the LEDs. And then I had to figure out how to make the CAN box, or the CAN hat, and the LEDs work together because they interfered with each other. So I had to manually create the LED signal in code. It's been really interesting. I mean, this is why you do this stuff. The best motivator for learning something is to build something you want to know, you want to have, and that you can't get. I mean, that's the story of this whole car. And so this is a great way to learn, is to have a project, have a goal that you're going for, and then learn the things you need to know to get there. This one in particular was a great way to bring in a bunch of little stuff I've been working on and to expand my knowledge in a bunch of different ways. I know things I didn't know before, which, as far as I'm concerned, this is education right here. This is outcome-based education. It's a great way to pick something up. So I strongly recommend, if you are interested in something like this, the investment is not high. This Pi on the bottom, this is the high end. This is a 3A, I think it's called. I think it's a $35 computer. I mean, you can spend up to $45 on the really high end ones. This little Pi Zero I was waving around, this is literally a $10 computer, and it runs. I have one of these running the HVAC in this shop. It runs a fan for humidity control. It runs the heater I got up there, and I can log into it anytime and just check to see what's going on. It'll let me know what the conditions are in the shop because I'm 100 feet away from my house. It's like a little $10 part. $5 if you don't want Wi-Fi. Travis.
Could you run your HVAC through that Pi with indicator lights in the dash?
Could I run my HVAC through the Pi with indicator lights on the dash? And actually, yes. One of my long-term goals of this car is to set up auto HVAC, which basically means I just set the temperature to a certain temperature, and then the car takes care of all the hard stuff like figuring out if the fan should be running, or the heat, or the AC. It's like all this modern stuff that cars figured out 20 years ago. Yeah, this Pi would have no problem doing that at all, because that's a very low effort thing for a computer. You don't realize how fast computers are compared to cars until you're looking at stuff like, oh, I need to figure out how fast the engine's running, and you realize that the engine runs at like 120 hertz, and these things are going, big deal, I got nothing else to do. Travis, we have another question.
Any plans to morph this into a more complicated heads-up display later on?
Any plans to morph this into a more complicated heads-up display? I'm not planning on doing a heads-up display. No. The nice thing about having the LEDs on the tachometer, and what the heck, we're still running this, aren't we? Are we? Did it shut down? No, there it is. Hi. I'll run it through the demo again, just because, hey, flashing lights. Flashing lights are fun. The nice thing about having this sort of display, and again, the needle is slipped, don't mind that, is that you can see it quite easily in your peripheral vision. You don't need to look down at it. So it's quite easy, especially as it changes colors through the rev range, which it's not doing on this demo. As it changes colors through the rev range, you can see those colors change, so you don't have to think, you don't have to look down at it, you can just see it out of your peripheral vision. So there's less need for a heads-up display. Engine speed or vehicle speed, I'm not checking that often. But certainly, yeah, you could, with the brightness of some of these LEDs, you put a little LED on the dashboard aimed at the windshield, you invert everything, and all of a sudden, boom, it's a heads-up display. It would be kind of fun to play with. I'm not planning on doing that, but if you plan on doing that and you do it, please let us know. Put it in the comments, do a YouTube video, send me pictures. I don't know, get your dad to describe it to you and send me a fax, whatever. It'll be fun. Let's just turn this back on again because I love playing with the... First off, it's fun to have them drive around. But I love this thing. Came to me one day when I was trying to think, what can I do with those LED rings that's not just a factory gauge that's looking a little funky? How can I properly call this a race dash? And this was my idea. This is the 3-axis accelerometer that's being used on the bottom here. That cost me all of $5. Big money being spent on this whole project, I tell you. The can hat was the most expensive part of it. But even then, you know, there's what's a normal race dash cost? Hundreds and hundreds of dollars. I've probably got $100, maybe $150 worth of parts in this thing. Plus I learned a bunch of stuff. Okay, you're going to park you there. There we go. Any more questions or comments going on there, Travis? Okay. I think I have covered everything. I did have somebody ask me ask about the oil pressure gauge, if it had been retrofitted to the non-fake version. This is an NA, an early NA. That's a proper oil pressure gauge with a proper analog sensor. I didn't touch these 3 gauges. The coolant temperature gauge is still completely stock. Have I got this right way around? Yeah. The fuel level is completely stock, and the oil pressure is completely stock, running off a factory sender that's in there. So that is a real oil pressure gauge. And then, as shown, I do have it running, don't I? I have the freak out option. Ah, you have no oil pressure. Okay, you have oil pressure. That was kind of fun. Anyway, and like I said, there's a few more things I'm going to add in there. But the biggest fun part of this now is I have the tools, I have the capabilities. So what can I make them do? And that's what I'm having a really good time trying to figure out. So if you have any ideas for what should be done with this thing, throw them in the comments. When I do get around to finalizing this to the point where I can share some of the code, we will put a link to that code in the description of the video. Probably it may be months until that happens, but just if you are looking at this in the year 2030 and you want to build something out of an antique pie that you found in the basement, I will put that out there. Most of this is actually written in Python, which is a pretty portable language. So even if you wanted to do it with an Arduino, you probably could get enough out of that to make it work out of an Arduino. Or if you want to make it work out of do I have one in here? I have some controllers that look like, and this is Xander again, that look like Lego Spaceman minifigs. They're the same scale and everything, the same height. And I could probably use one to run most of this just because it would be stupid fun. I started with the Pi because I know it and because it has far more horsepower than I need, but if you really could do what I'm doing with quite a bit less horsepower. But, you know, then I couldn't use it for a dash cam. So, that's all I've got going on here today. Let's run through this again just because, woo, look at it swinging around. And again, the needle has slipped. I apologize for that. Wow, it's really slipped, hasn't it? It's just using the wrong end of the needle, that's all. And now it's just showing some of the different colors and things. Anyhow, there you go. This is sort of a glimpse into what I do on a Friday night, because I'm that kind of crazy guy. Some of my coworkers doing things. We have several who are musicians. Brandon and Jeremy are both Mike and Jeremy are both musicians. Brandon is fixing up a cabin and working on his old van. Volkswagen van again, not a sketchy old free candy van down by the river. Matt's got that crazy V8 rally hill climb Miata with a sequential gearbox. You want to check the Hoonigan autofocus feature on that. This is the sort of stuff that we do when we're not doing Flyin Miata every day. So there you go, little peek behind the curtain. Thanks for your attention. We'll be back next week with something probably a little more directly related to how you live your Miata life. Do we have a question there, Travis? You're twitching. Okay. We'll be back next week with something might be a little more applicable to you, a little bit less out of left field, but I hope you enjoyed seeing what we're doing here. And there you go. My name's Keith Tanner from Flyin Miata, and thanks for your attention.